This is farm country, Wisconsin. High school sweethearts Tim Hack and Kelly Drew are at the wedding of a friend. The couple have plans to go to the carnival, so they don't stay long. They have a drink, then disappear into the night, never to be seen again.
We do take this part of Wisconsin for granted. We love the sunrises and the sunsets and the planting and harvesting of crops. Some of us are lucky enough to meet our high school sweetheart and get married.
Tim and Kelly started dating in high school. Tim would bring Kelly out to the farm.
I thought it was kind of cool that a city girl would come and hang around with a farm boy.
They were a good couple. I really do believe that the two of them would eventually be married, that they would be a couple for life.
Tim and Kelly were going to go to a wedding reception at the Concord House.
Tim and Kelly get to the Concord House at approximately 10:30 p.m. They're there for approximately half an hour, 45 minutes. Witnesses say that Tim had a beer and Kelly had a soda during the time they were there, and there are witnesses that see them leave.
The next morning, get up and get work done. Except when you got up in the morning and Tim wasn't there, instantly there was a level of concern. If he wasn't going to come home, he was going to stay with a friend, you'd call.
We called Kelly's mom and said, "Did they stay there?" She said no. I drove up to the Concord House to look. Tim's car was still there. The door wasn't quite shut, and his wallet was still in the car. And that was not like him to do stuff like that. From there on, we finally realized Tim and Kelly are gone.
The sheriff's department finds cigarettes, checkbook, wallet. There did not appear any sign of a struggle.
They were boyfriend and girlfriend. There was some talk, I remember. Did they elope? Did they take a bus someplace?
Our kitchen actually became a command post.
Dave knows that something's wrong.
Something has happened. We need to figure out what happened. If they had run off to Las Vegas and got married, they would have called us. They wouldn't have let us sit and worry about them.
In the first 4 days, they were talking to all the employees from the Concord House. We're talking to wedding guests.
One consistent thing that was reported was that there was this dark, dirty van that had been in the parking lot. One witness specifically recalled the van taking off, sort of in a suspicious fashion, in a quick way.
The Concord House itself was right next to the interstate. There's a big parking lot. There's not a lot of lighting or anything out there. If you were intent on abducting somebody, all you had to do was wait for the right moment.
We need to find the kids.
The community stepped up. All the local farmers were there to help do some searches around the Concord house.
They're searching vacant buildings. They're searching everywhere that they can find.
Everybody was involved. This is one of the largest manhunts in the state of Wisconsin.
Didn't seem real. Nothing seemed real. You'd have 2 news helicopters landing in the field next to the house. I mean, how real is that?
We checked every place we could think of. There was nothing that could lead us to them.
A teenager on his tractor had seen something as he was driving that caught his eye. A pair of pants, just like Kelly had been wearing on the night that she disappeared. Both the left and the right leg are completely cut from the ankle all the way up to the waist. And so, in other words, the pants could have still been on her body, but they had been cut away.
It just magnified what I had thought all along, that someone had definitely raped her.
Over the course of 10 days, multiple pieces of clothing belonging to Kelly are found along the roadway within a 6-mile radius of the Concord house, as well as about a dozen pieces of rope with various knots tied in it.
We have very good evidence now, but we need Tim and Kelly.
Squirrel hunters from Milwaukee are out in the Ixonia, Wisconsin area, which is approximately 7 miles from the Concord house. While they're walking through a wooded area, they stumble across a body and immediately contact law enforcement. The body was badly decomposed. It's dark out, it's nighttime, so law enforcement sets up a perimeter around this area until daylight. Approximately 100 yards away, they locate a male body that's fully clothed and appears to be the same clothing that Tim was reported to have been wearing on August 9th, 1980.
The manner of death for both of them was homicide.
I had the radio on, and they announced over the radio that they had indeed found both bodies. And so I'm going to tear up. So I remember walking in the kitchen, and the detective is there with my parents, telling them that they did indeed find Tim and Kelly.
There were ligature marks on Kelly's ankles and wrists that were consistent with having been bound. Kelly was most possibly strangled based on damage and insect activity around the throat area. So then these pieces of rope we're finding along the roadsides become extremely significant.
There's the regular square knot, but there's also half hitches, clove hitches, bowline knots. This is somebody with knowledge of knot tying, somebody that's been in the Navy or the military or in the trades, like a carpenter, maybe a painter. It's not going to just be your everyday person that's going to tie these types of knots. This is a tight-knit community, so the phone calls are coming in, the tips are coming in.
There's a tip that comes in from a woman who believes that her husband may have been involved in the murders of Tim and Kelly.
This suspect, Mr. James, lived in the area where the bodies were found. He does roofing work, works with ropes. He's known to carry a knife on his belt. He has a van, and on August 10th of 1980, shortly after the disappearance of Tim and Kelly, he has his wife and stepdaughters completely clean out the van. A lot of things are adding up here. This could be the guy that took Tim and Kelly. There were a lot of things that were adding up for Mr. James being our suspect. So a search warrant is obtained to search the property to try to see if they could find anything linking Mr. James to Tim Hack and Kelly Drew.
They retrieve clothing that is eerily similar to Kelly's shirt, both in terms of color and the way that it's torn.
They find ropes tied in knots. They find what could be blood.
They transport this clothing to the crime lab for testing.
As they're conducting a search, they received information from his wife. She said that he's an alcoholic, he's violent. He, according to his wife, had tied her up in the past. And that his wife said that her daughters, his stepdaughters, were being sexually assaulted by him. Officers took him into custody so that he could be questioned in regards to Tim and Kelly. He was questioned at length. He denied any involvement, and a polygraph or lie detector test was used on him.
Polygraphs aren't admissible at trial, but they do give investigators at least some guidance as to whether a suspect is being truthful.
He admits to the sexual assault of his stepdaughters, but denies any knowledge of Tim or Kelly, denies ever meeting them, abducting them, ever being at the Concord house.
It was the examiner's determination that Mr. James was being truthful when he denied having any involvement in Tim and Kelly's murders.
Mr. James ultimately is convicted of the sexual assault of his stepdaughters and sent away. However, he remains a suspect in this case.
I know that my parents and Kelly's parents worked together on planning the funerals. They died together. They wanted them to be together eternally.
Dave never let it go because Dave was always searching for justice for Tim.
You think it should be solved. You got to blame somebody. We were looking at anything that was going to help solve it.
Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were a pair of drifters who were arrested on a number of very minor charges. After their apprehension, they started confessing to dozens and dozens of murders. As a result, detectives from all over the country now have to become involved in the investigation to see if any of their cold cases involved Lucas or Toole.
What led us to believe that they could be responsible was that they had abducted so many women and men, sexually assaulting them and at times killing them. There were a total of either 4 or 5 cases in Wisconsin at that time that were unsolved that could have been them.
A serial killer with a drifter lifestyle can leave a trail of bodies and no one can actually pinpoint them to be in that location at any given time. One of the murders Henry Lee Lucas confessed to was the Orange Socks Drifter. This was a young Jane Doe, unidentified, who was found murdered wearing only orange socks. The Orange Socks Drifter was strangled and raped, very similar to the way Kelly Drew was. Because of the similarities in these crimes, this was a significant motivating factor for detectives to go interview Lucas and Toole.
There was optimism. Now it's getting serious. You just had that feeling that they were going to solve this case.
Lucas and Toole are confessing to in excess of 300 rapes and homicides that they've done across the country.
The reasons that Lucas and Toole might confess to all these crimes might be to gain attention. It might be important for them. Maybe it fed their egos.
Our investigator went to interview Lucas and Toole regarding Tim and Kelly. What led investigators to believe that they could be responsible for the murder of Tim and Kelly was that they had committed 2 separate homicides in Wisconsin. Lucas and Toole had previously admitted to being in Wisconsin, traveling on I-94, very close to where Tim and Kelly disappeared from at the Concord house. And the time frame was around the same time frame as Tim and Kelly's disappearance.
Do you know where this girl's at? I want you to admit to it. They scattered here in about 48 different states. Well, I know. But who's going to do it if we don't? How many people did you kill, Jimmy? 150.
Investigators and the families believed that the murderer had been found. And it was all that people could talk about was that finally we know who did it.
Investigators established a detailed timeline and find that Lucas and Toole were in Wisconsin in September and October of 1980. However, they were not in Wisconsin in August of 1980.
I mean, they certainly were killers, serial killers even, but they were not involved in Tim and Kelly's murders.
Tips aren't coming in. All the evidence that has been found has been processed, has been sent in. All the leads that have been developed have pretty much been followed up on.
The reality was we weren't making any progress towards identifying a suspect. Eventually the leads dry up and the case goes cold.
The case remains cold for more than 2 decades. The Hack family is forced to move on without their oldest son.
I sold the family farm. I always felt Tim would eventually take over the farm, but then after they died, it didn't really make any difference anymore because it was no longer a family farm.
You always expected Tim and Kelly to be there to run the farm, to run the crops. It just leaves a hole.
When I turned 18, my parents gave me Tim's car, and I still have the car, I still drive the car, I still love the car. I just didn't want Tim and Kelly forgotten.
A big part of my love for the community is that it's where I grew up. It's where I'm raising my daughter now. Small towns are safe. You know, you can let your kids out at night and they can play without fear. I was 8 years old at the time Tim and Kelly went missing. So when I first was elected district attorney, I was well aware of this case. And I wanted to know what happened to Tim and Kelly.
When I got the case, it was 26 years old at that point. Knowing what a big case this was after being unsolved for so long, it immediately became my #1 goal to solve this case. I reviewed thousands of pages of reports, attachments, maps, and photos. But in general, there's limited evidence I have to go with. But what I do have was Kelly's clothes. At that time, DNA is becoming more and more popular.
And that was something that wasn't available to law enforcement back in 1980.
The clothing was submitted to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, and they told us that they did have DNA. The DNA located on Kelly's pants and underwear was from seminal fluid. So this was a huge break in the case. This is incredible.
I think for the first time in my life, I felt like there's a ray of hope here.
In looking at the maps, you could see where there were clearly 3 major roads that were used to dump the bodies and to dump the evidence. And so a triangle was established. At one point is where the majority of the evidence was found. At another point is the Concord house. And at the third corner would be the location where Tim and Kelly's bodies were found. So this was something somebody used to throw us off the track, or this person lives or is very familiar with this area.
Though he cannot know for sure, Garcia says his gut tells him someone local is responsible.
Media is a valuable tool for law enforcement to use. They have a huge audience, and they can get people to say something they normally wouldn't say, or maybe get people to feel that what they thought wasn't important is important. It had been a couple months since the news story ran, and one evening I received a phone call. It was a female who identifies herself as April. She explains to me that their family were basically drifters, that they lived in a lot of locations. In the summer of 1980, they lived in the Concord area within that triangle. She said, "I think my dad could be responsible for Tim and Kelly. I think he killed them." April believes her father may be involved in the disappearance and killing of Tim and Kelly. And she said his name is Edward Wayne Edwards. She tells me about a book that he had written that she said would explain more about her father.
Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
Back in the early 70s. Edwards appears on numerous talk shows and game shows with this book about his life as a master criminal. In the late 60s, Edwards was on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list. He was a suspect in a double homicide in Portland, Oregon. They couldn't prove that he did it, but upon checking the criminal history of Edward Wayne Edwards, I see that he has been in prison. He has been convicted of numerous crimes to include robbery, vehicle theft, fraud, arson. He's done a lot of things.
And he goes on the circuit talking to people about what a horrible person he had been, but what a great person he had become.
I met a man who was a guard at the penitentiary, and he's the one that helped me to rehabilitate.
As I read the book, what was so interesting was he exhibited all of the classic signs of, the stereotypical signs of a serial killer. He was a bedwetter. He had an affinity for starting fires. He was extremely controlling.
For some serial killers, the need to put on a normal face to interact with members of society and have access to victims is very important. In fact, if they looked unusual or weird or bizarre, they might not get to approach victims in the way that they need to.
My life has certainly been anything but good. Dangerous, yes. Honest, no.
In addition to that, Edward's daughter, April, had told me her dad was in the military, that he had been dishonorably discharged from the military.
So Ed Edwards knows how to tie these knots. And his house is smack dab in the middle of where Kelly and Tim were last seen alive and where their bodies were ultimately located. This drifter, stranger who floated around, who wasn't really from Wisconsin. He wasn't from Jefferson County. We obviously have a new prime suspect.
I start going back through the reports and seeing if there's a mention of Edward Wayne Edwards. And I had him on my suspect list. Edwards was interviewed in early September of 1980. He really didn't have a lot of information to offer. He did not know anything about Tim or Kelly's disappearance. The one thing that stuck out to me was that he had a broken nose. He said it was a deer hunting incident that caused the rifle to kick back and caused the broken nose. That seemed odd to me. Gun deer hunting in Wisconsin is November, not in August. Once I found out where Edwards had lived, I talked to the landlord that took care of the house. He said that Edwards lived in that house for a brief time and then moved to another state shortly after the disappearance of Tim and Kelly.
They packed up in the middle of the night during the school year.
There are advantages to having a drifter-like lifestyle. You're not accountable for your whereabouts at any given time. You don't necessarily have people tracking you and keeping up on your location. For a serial killer, it's actually quite ideal.
The landlord also found some rope in the garage, and this rope was of similar characteristics to the rope that was found alongside the road. Edwards had a van. He kept a .357 revolver in the van. This van adds up with the van that was spotted that night. What was especially suspicious in 1980, Edward Wayne Edwards was a handyman at the Concord house. Everything was making sense. Everything was pointing towards Edwards. I think I know what happened to Tim and Kelly. Edwards was waiting in the parking lot. Kelly fit the profile he was looking for. Tim, being a strong farm boy, got a good swing in on Edwards, causing the broken nose. And that's when Tim was stabbed. There's no telling what happened in the van, but we know that Kelly was raped and strangled to death. I need to go to Louisville, Kentucky. I need to talk to Edwards, and I need to get his DNA.
If Ed Edwards truly was a psychopath, Not having a conscience, not having empathy, not being afraid of punishment would have made it very easy for Edwards to kill again.
I was nervous. I realized what kind of person I was dealing with. There was a high probability that Edwards committed these crimes. He is a very, very dangerous person. This was it. I was surprised with his health condition. He was in a wheelchair, on oxygen, very overweight, and not in very good health. Throughout the entire time that we spoke with him, he acted very nonchalant, like it didn't matter that we were there at all.
For some serial killers, it is a game. Given Edwards' age, it might have been this was his last opportunity to manipulate law enforcement.
When I asked him to provide a sample of his DNA so that we could test it, he said that he had no problem doing that. He thinks he's smarter than us. After 29 years, he's thinking, what DNA are we going to have? How are we going to prove this? Turns out it's a match. At the time, we take him into custody.
We're just waiting on those guys. Let's take to talk to your wife.
Edwards is acting as though this is no big deal.
Oh, okay, with my wife. That's a big concern. I'm joking.
No, they're not.
I'm joking.
I know you are.
So one of the traits of a psychopath is this superficial charm that they can turn on and off at will in order to do their bidding.
Hey, thanks.
No problem.
They call you Cal? Is that what you told me? Kyle. Thank you. Thank you.
Myself and the DCI agent speak with Edwards. I'm willing to make a statement and answer questions. I do not want a lawyer at this time. Do you agree with that?
We'll go over them again if you're not comfortable.
No, everything's fine.
Everything's fine, okay.
He waives his Miranda rights, and we explain a number of things showing that he is responsible for this. We're trying to get him to give us his version of events. This is your shot. I mean, this is your show. If there's anything you want to get off your chest, I'm yours. I'm here to listen to you. But unfortunately, this is your only shot. He completely denies ever killing anyone. You say that you didn't kill him. Okay?
That's right. I've never killed anyone.
All right. I'm going to ask you this then.
And enough
Who did? Who did it? Throughout the 8+ hours of interviewing with Edwards, he remained calm the entire time, and he frequently would try to change topics.
I use 2 shots of insulin a day.
He would talk about anything he could to stay away from talking about Tim and Kelly.
My mind is just a muddle.
His manipulating law enforcement in the interrogations is very consistent with who Ed Edwards is and had been his entire life. He lied, he manipulated, he conned.
You can continue this all you want.
I know.
I think this is just a game for you. And he's right. Your DNA was there. And that's the bottom line.
Yes,
so you can explain
you're
just a notebook. You're not in charge. You talk to us.
He's lying to us, trying to beat us, thinking he's smarter than us. So I decided to feed into his ego. And I had his book with me. But if you wouldn't mind signing the book, you mind doing that for me? Oh, money.
Well, how much
I'm a police officer. I don't have any money. And he did enjoy that.
I'm going to sign this as Wayne, okay?
Sure. During the final hour or 2 of the interview, we asked him if he could explain the seminal fluid DNA being on Kelly's clothes.
So then he comes up with the most unbelievable story.
All right, I had sex with her.
You had sex with the young lady who died?
Yes.
Okay, that explains why. Consensual?
Ooh,
with me? Yes. Oh, yes.
Not forcible, not...
Oh, no. It was consensual.
Tim and Kelly were joined at the hip. Kelly Drew's not going to go off and willingly have sex with Ed Edwards in a cornfield. But Edwards' defense attorney could have said it was consensual sex. We as prosecutors have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the person. And the DNA was really good. But from a prosecutor's standpoint, is that strong enough?
After conducting the interview of Edwards, which was digitally recorded, I went back to see if maybe there was something he said that I didn't pick up on, or maybe there were certain movements he made to tell me when he was lying.
Her boyfriend.
As I'm watching the video, something struck me. There was a comment that he made when nobody was speaking with him, and it was myself and Detective Sergeant Brian Nunn in the room. He said something sort of under his breath.
We probably rewound it, 1,000 times trying to make sure that we heard what we heard. I can remember exactly where I was when I heard that recording.
He thought it was under his breath, or maybe it was subconsciously that he said it, but he clearly wasn't saying it out loud. It was quietly said. And after listening to it repeatedly and having many others listen to it repeatedly, everyone agreed that what he said is,
I killed her.
Damn it, I killed her.
I killed her.
To hear him say, damn it, I killed her. It's a goosebump moment. Rarely do you have someone who's committed a double homicide actually admit what they did, and that took away any possibility that he would not be found guilty.
We got him. We got our guy. And ultimately, he pleads guilty to killing Tim and Kelly. We don't know why he confessed. He had been playing the game of cat and mouse for many years. But I was happy to see that the two families did get closure.
It was over, that feeling of it's over.
Ed Edwards returns to Wisconsin to face justice for the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. But as his health fails, he reveals a 33-year secret to the cold case detectives.
While Edwards is in the infirmary in Wisconsin, he begins sending letters to a detective in Ohio regarding two other young people that he had murdered, Billy Lavaco and Judith Straub. His goal is to return to Ohio and get the death penalty for killing them.
Edwards wants to maintain control over his life, over his trajectory, and he will say anything and do anything when the opportunity presents itself to maintain that control.
He's again trying to manipulate the system and control, his future. But he doesn't know that there was a chunk of time that went over the Lavaco and Straub homicides where the death penalty did not apply. So once he realizes that, Edwards confesses to killing his foster son, Danny.
I felt bad, but apparently not bad enough that I kept from doing it.
And that's the case that is death penalty eligible. We don't generally, in prosecution circles, give defendants what they want. But it's going to solve 5 homicides now.
There are people working in law enforcement who do believe that Edwards committed many more murders than he confessed to.
Edwards was an over-the-road truck driver that traveled to California in the late 60s. Because of this, some people believe Edward Wayne Edwards is the Zodiac Killer. Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in Northern California in 1968 and 1969.
Some of the links include the fact that Edwards was a drifter and he could have been in California at this time, the fact that Edwards killed couples, and that the Zodiac Killer also killed couples.
Symbols that are used to sign off on the Zodiac letters consist of 13 symbols. Edward Edwards is 13 letters, and his birth name of Charles Murray is 13 letters as well.
The more trouble you get into, the bigger you are. This is why I was out there committing the crime, was for the recognition.
It definitely was the highlight of my career to get somebody like that, especially for the families, to get this done and to put a bad person behind bars.
Ed Edwards was held accountable for what he did, and he had to admit what he had done, and I think that, really brings me some peace.
Tim and Kelly's death made us realize that there are terrible things in the world, and you have to appreciate every day and what we have.
I think Tim was a son that a lot of fathers would have liked to have.
And we'll never know what may have been, but we don't.
The nature of truth is often far more fragile than we would like to believe. In the realm of criminal investigations, we rely on the physical world to tell us the story of what happened when there are no witnesses left to speak. We look for blood, for footprints, for the subtle disturbances in an environment that cry out that a violent act has occurred. We trust that the universe will leave a mark when a life is unjustly taken. But what happens when the physical world is intentionally manipulated to tell a lie? What happens when a killer is not just brutal, but terrifyingly calculating, using the very environment to shield their malice behind the facade of a tragic accident? In the history of true crime, there is nothing more chilling than the perfect illusion, a carefully constructed narrative designed to paralyze the justice system. This is the story of an illusion that almost held its ground against the test of time. It is a sprawling, global saga about a man who believed he could outrun his own shadow, crossing continents and oceans to bury his darkest sins on an isolated island paradise. But at its very core, before the Grand Evasion and the international manhunt, this is the story of Shannon Davis, a woman whose voice was violently silenced and hidden beneath the guise of a heartbreaking countryside misfortune. The year was 1980. It was the month of July, a time when the state of Michigan is typically bathed in deep summer warmth. The rural landscapes of the American Midwest during this season are defined by their sprawling open spaces, dense, vibrant greenery, and a heavy, humid stillness that settles comfortably over the isolated counties. It is a place where the communities are inherently small and tightly knit, where neighbors recognize each other on the long, winding dirt roads, and where the rhythm of everyday life is dictated by the predictable turn of the seasons and the land itself. In this kind of setting, violent crime feels like a completely foreign entity, an anomaly that belongs in crowded cities, not among the quiet pastures. The rural expanses offer a profound sense of isolation, which can be a beautiful sanctuary for those seeking a peaceful existence away from the noise of the modern world. However, that exact same isolation can serve as a perfect, undisturbed shroud for those harboring dark, violent intentions. Shannon Davis lived her life within this environment. She was surrounded by the natural beauty of the Michigan countryside, a place that by all accounts should have been her ultimate safe haven. The rural lifestyle, deeply intertwined with nature and the outdoors, was her reality. Yet, it was this very sanctuary that was twisted into the stage upon which her life was brutally and prematurely taken. The tragedy of Shannon's death is not just in the loss of her life, but in the profound betrayal that accompanied it. She was murdered by the person she should have been able to trust the most in the world, her husband, David Davis. He did not simply take her life in a moment of reckless passion. He calculated her demise with a cold, detached precision that is difficult for the ordinary mind to comprehend. There is a highly specific, deeply unsettling kind of cruelty involved in staging a murder to look like an accident. It requires a mind that can completely disconnect from the humanity of the victim, viewing a spouse not as a human being, but merely as a problem that needs to be permanently solved and an obstacle that must be removed. David Davis orchestrated a false narrative with terrifying clarity. He chose to frame the brutal murder of his wife as a tragic horse riding accident. In the rural setting where they lived, horses were a natural part of the landscape. They are powerful, massive, and sometimes unpredictable animals. An actual accident involving a riding horse can easily result in severe trauma, blunt force injuries, broken bones, and fatal outcomes. By choosing this incredibly specific method of deception, David Davis ruthlessly exploited the inherent, well-known risks of equestrian activities to mask his own horrific violence. To make the lie convincing, the physical evidence on Shannon's body had to align with the fabricated story. She was found deceased, bearing catastrophic, fatal wounds. The sheer physical trauma inflicted upon her was immense, designed by her husband to be easily misconstrued by first responders as the tragic, unavoidable result of a heavy fall or a crushing blow from a panicked animal. The cold calculation required to inflict such specific damage upon one's own wife, and then calmly position the scene to tell a fictitious story of an animal-related disaster, speaks to a deeply sociopathic level of self-preservation. David Davis stood in the summer heat of Michigan in July 1980, looking at the life he had just extinguished, and methodically arranged the pieces of his lethal puzzle to ensure his own survival. When a body is found in such rural circumstances, the immediate, compassionate human reaction of first responders is to look for the most logical, least sinister explanation. A woman, a known equestrian environment, a fatal blunt force injury. The tragic equation seems to solve itself immediately. But the undeniable truth of a crime scene always speaks, even if it is only in a whisper, easily drowned out by the loud, immediate, and emotionally overwhelming narrative of a tragic accident. When Shannon Davis was discovered lifeless, the environment around her had already been severely compromised. A staged crime scene is, by its very definition, a disturbed crime scene. The perpetrator intentionally alters the physical space, moving the victim, introducing foreign elements, or removing crucial pieces of evidence to perfectly fit the fabricated story they intend to tell the authorities. In the immediate aftermath of Shannon's death, the physical space where she lost her life was expertly manipulated to tell a compelling lie. This intentional manipulation created an immediate, almost insurmountable barrier for the local law enforcement officers who responded to the call. To truly understand the immense, frustrating challenges faced by the investigators in this case, one must transport themselves back to the investigative reality of 1980. In the modern era of criminal justice, detectives are armed with an incredibly sophisticated arsenal of scientific tools. Advanced DNA profiling, complex blood spatter analysis, digital cell phone footprints, and ubiquitous surveillance cameras often make it exceptionally difficult for a modern killer to completely hide their actions. But in the summer of 1980, the forensic landscape was vastly different and far more limited. The scientific tools available to local police departments were rudimentary by today's standards. Investigators relied heavily on basic blood typing, standard pathology, circumstantial evidence, and the raw intuition forged through years of working on the job. When the local police arrived at the rural Michigan property, they were met with a scene that had been carefully curated specifically to deceive them. The fatal wounds on Shannon's body were undeniably severe, but proving beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt in a court of law that they were inflicted intentionally by human hands, rather than by the hooves or the sheer weight of a massive horse, required a level of scientific certainty that the technology of the time simply struggled to provide. The local medical examiners and forensic technicians were looking at a puzzle where the killer had intentionally thrown away the most important pieces. Because the scene had been so thoroughly zoetron, or disturbed, the pure, uncontaminated evidence needed to definitively separate a violent homicide from a tragic equestrian accident was tragically out of reach. Despite the severe limitations of forensic science in that era, The sharp intuition of seasoned investigators cannot be entirely silenced by a staged scene. Almost immediately, there were dark shadows of doubt lingering heavily around David Davis. Law enforcement officers are trained to observe human behavior just as closely as they observe physical evidence. There were profound questions surrounding David's attitude and demeanor in the wake of his wife's sudden, violent death. The way he spoke, the subtle inconsistencies that almost always plague a fabricated story over time, his emotional responses, or chilling lack thereof, these elements cast a long, dark veil of suspicion over him. The local police, looking at the totality of the circumstances and trusting their experienced gut instincts, harbored deep, unshakable suspicions that the grieving husband was merely playing a role. They saw through the subtle cracks in his performance, sensing the cold, calculating detachment that lay just beneath the surface of his supposedly tragic loss. However, the American justice system is rightfully built upon a strict foundation of concrete, undeniable proof. Suspicion, no matter how strong, no matter how universally shared among the investigative team, is never a substitute for legal evidence. The disturbed, manipulated nature of the crime scene, combined inextricably with the lack of advanced forensic capabilities, left the local police force in a paralyzing, deeply frustrating bind. They knew, in their hearts and in their minds, that a brutal murder had occurred in that quiet rural county, but they simply lacked the legal ammunition required to formally charge David Davis and strip him of his freedom. They desperately needed definitive, scientific proof to pierce the heavy veil of the staged accident, and in that fateful summer of 1980, that proof completely eluded them. Because the burden of proof rests entirely on the state, and because that burden could not be met, David Davis temporarily escaped the grasp of the law. He slipped through the fingers of justice by the narrowest of margins, entirely shielded by the very illusion he had so carefully created. He was allowed to walk away from the scene of his wife's murder as a free man, leaving behind a devastated family and a frustrated police force, having successfully committed what appeared at the time to be the perfect crime. This catastrophic failure of immediate justice is a tremendously bitter pill to swallow. For the grieving family of Shannon Davis, it meant being forced to live every single day with the agonizing, suffocating reality that her killer was walking free. He was breathing the air that she was forever denied, moving forward with a life that was now built entirely on a foundation of absolute deceit and horrific violence. The thought of a murderer living without consequence is a heavy weight on the conscience of any society. But the annals of true crime history are filled with extraordinary stories of delayed, relentless justice. The initial escape of David Davis in the summer of 1980 was not the end of this dark narrative. It was merely the conclusion of its very first chapter. The physical files in the local police department may have been temporarily shelved due to a lack of actionable evidence, but the memory of the brutal crime remained deeply etched in the minds of the investigators who had stood at that rural Michigan scene. They carried the heavy psychological burden of the unsolved case, waiting patiently for the day when the scales of justice could finally be forcefully balanced. The temporary, unearned victory of David Davis set the stage for a sprawling, complex saga of evasion that would test the absolute limits of federal law enforcement. His initial success in outsmarting the local authorities gave him the false confidence to believe he could disappear forever. This arrogant assumption would eventually trigger one of the most fascinating and relentless manhunts in FBI history, transforming a local Michigan tragedy into a desperate flight across continents and initiating a radical transformation of identity that would eventually lead federal investigators to pull back the curtain on his life in the most unexpected and isolated corners of the globe. The story of how the truth finally caught up to David Davis is a testament to the fact that while justice may sometimes sleep, it never truly dies. Time is the greatest enemy of a criminal, but it is very often the strongest ally of a relentless investigator. The years following the violent death of Shannon Davis in 1980 slowly drifted by, marked by the changing of the seasons across the rural Michigan landscape. For the local community, the initial shock of the tragedy might have dulled into a quiet, lingering sadness. But for the dedicated law enforcement officers who had walked that disturbed, manipulated crime scene, the case was never truly closed. It was a deep wound that refused to heal, a constant, nagging reminder of a profound injustice. They had known from the very beginning that the grieving husband routine was a carefully orchestrated performance, a mask hiding a calculating killer. However, knowing the truth and proving it in a court of law are two vastly different realities. As the calendar pages turned, pushing further into the decade, the landscape of criminal investigation began to undergo a quiet revolution. Forensic methodologies slowly advanced, and the understanding of staged crime scenes grew deeper and more sophisticated. Eventually, the sheer gravity of the unresolved homicide drew the attention of federal investigators. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, equipped with broader resources and fresh perspectives, decided to breathe new life into the stagnant files. They meticulously re-examined every single piece of circumstantial evidence, meticulously searching for the subtle inconsistencies that David Davis might have overlooked in his haste to fabricate an accident. They returned to the original witnesses, carefully extracting forgotten details and fresh testimonies that, when woven together, formed a much clearer, undeniably damning picture of what had truly happened on that summer day. Slowly but surely, the formidable weight of justice began to tip. The authorities finally amassed the evidentiary threshold required to officially pierce the illusion. A federal warrant for the arrest of David Davis on the charge of murder was formally issued. The trap had finally been set, and the authorities moved swiftly to secure the man who had stolen Shannon's life. But when they arrived to close the iron gates of justice around him, they found nothing but an empty space. There is a highly primal, almost animalistic instinct that awakens within a fugitive when they sense the invisible net of law enforcement beginning to tighten. David Davis, a man whose entire existence was now predicated on a foundation of deception, had developed an acute sensitivity to the shifting winds of the investigation. He could feel the renewed pressure, the subtle changes in the air that signaled his time was rapidly running out. Before the federal agents could even approach his doorstep, he made a calculated, desperate decision to abandon the life he had known. He vanished into the ether, leaving behind the Midwestern fields for an existence defined entirely by perpetual motion and paralyzing paranoia. His initial instinct for survival drove him northward, toward the unforgiving, icy expanses of Alaska. For a man seeking to obliterate his own footprint, Alaska offers a vast, seemingly endless sanctuary of isolation. It is a frontier environment where people often go to intentionally disappear, a place where the harshness of the elements demands absolute focus on daily survival, leaving little room for questions about a stranger's past. In the deep freeze of the northern wilderness, David Davis sought to bury his sins under layers of snow and anonymity. He navigated the rugged terrain, hoping that the sheer geographical distance and the desolate landscape would sever the ties connecting him to the bloody reality of Michigan. But the isolation of Alaska, while effective for hiding from the eyes of the law, offers no true sanctuary from the haunting echoes of one's own mind. The freezing temperatures and the long, dark nights provided too much silence, too much time for the reality of his relentless pursuit to settle in. He knew that the FBI possessed a reach that extended far beyond the lower 48 states, and the sprawling emptiness of Alaska could easily become a frozen trap if the federal agents managed to trace his movements. Driven by an intoxicating mixture of fear and restlessness, the fugitive abandoned the northern isolation and began a tense, erratic journey down the western coastline of the United States. He eventually submerged himself in the chaotic, densely populated environment of California. This geographic shift represented a completely different strategy for evasion. Instead of hiding in the empty wilderness, he attempted to hide in plain sight among the millions of transient souls who flow through the Golden State every single day. But living as a wanted man in a modern, interconnected society is a psychologically devastating endeavor. It requires a state of hypervigilance that slowly erodes the human psyche. Every single interaction becomes a potential threat. A routine traffic stop, a casual conversation with a neighbor, or a simple request for identification at a local bank could instantly trigger the collapse of his carefully constructed freedom. In California, David Davis became a master of shadows, constantly altering his physical appearance, changing his routines, and utilizing untraceable methods of communication to stay one desperately small step ahead of the relentless federal pursuit. He lived out of suitcases, never allowing his roots to penetrate the soil, always keeping an eye fixed nervously on the rearview mirror of his life. The golden sunshine of California offered no warmth to a man deeply chilled by the constant, suffocating fear of capture. He recognized with chilling clarity that remaining on the continental United States was essentially a prolonged game of Russian roulette. The federal dragnet was vast, possessing infinite resources and unparalleled patience. It was only a matter of time before a single mistake, a fleeting moment of carelessness, or a random stroke of bad luck would lead the authorities directly to his door. He needed a sanctuary that was fundamentally beyond the conventional reach of the American mainland. He needed a place where the past could not simply follow him, but where it would completely lose his scent. It was this desperate realization that catalyzed his most audacious and shocking maneuver. In a bold, incredibly calculated move designed to completely sever his connection to the United States mainland, David Davis turned his gaze toward the vast, blue expanse of the South Pacific. He orchestrated a quiet, untraceable departure, fleeing across the ocean to the remote, incredibly isolated islands of American Samoa. This geographic leap was a masterstroke of criminal evasion. American Samoa is a solitary, unincorporated territory of the United States, a tiny volcanic archipelago floating alone in the incredibly vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles away from the bustling cities of California and the rural farmlands of Michigan. It is a place of breathtaking tropical beauty, characterized by lush, emerald green mountains, pristine beaches, and a profound, tranquil isolation that feels entirely disconnected from the rapid pace of the Western world. By crossing the ocean, David Davis was not merely changing his zip code. He was entirely crossing into a different dimension of existence. The logistical challenges of tracking a fugitive to such a remote location in the 1980s were monumental. The physical distance alone created a massive, incredibly complex barrier for the federal agents who were desperately trying to pick up his cold trail. In this tropical paradise, far removed from the technological surveillance and the interconnected law enforcement databases of the mainland, the fugitive found the ultimate, impenetrable hiding spot. The sheer contrast between the violent, brutal reality of his crime and the serene, untouched beauty of his chosen sanctuary is deeply disturbing. He brought the dark, heavy weight of murder into a place defined by its gentle breezes and vibrant, peaceful communities. Upon arriving in this remote Pacific haven, David Davis knew that physical distance alone would never be enough to guarantee his permanent freedom. He needed to completely obliterate the man he once was. The killer from Michigan had to die so that a completely new entity could be born. In the quiet, unassuming villages of American Samoa, he shed his former identity like a diseased skin and meticulously constructed the persona of David Bell. This was not simply a change of name on a forged document. It was a comprehensive, terrifyingly thorough psychological transformation. He systematically abandoned every single habit, every preference, and every defining characteristic that might potentially link him back to his previous life. He suppressed his past so completely that the man who had brutally taken the life of Shannon Davis seemed to entirely evaporate into the humid island air. David Bell, the newly minted island resident, integrated himself into the local community with a quiet, calculated humility. He embraced the fundamental nature of the island lifestyle, turning his hands to the soil and adopting the deeply unpretentious life of a local farmer. He spent his days cultivating the earth, growing crops beneath the intense Pacific sun, allowing his skin to weather and his hands to callous. This grueling, physical labor served as the perfect, unquestionable cover. It painted him as a simple, hard-working man, completely devoid of the sophisticated malice required to orchestrate a complex, staged murder. The deeply ingrained culture of American Samoa is profoundly rooted in community, hospitality, and a genuine, open-hearted acceptance of others. The local residents, living in their tight-knit, trusting island society, had absolutely no reason to suspect that the quiet, seemingly gentle farmer living among them was harboring a monstrous, deadly secret. They welcomed David Bell into their world with open arms, completely unaware of the invisible blood that stained his past. He navigated their deeply rooted customs and social structures with chilling ease, mirroring their kindness and playing the role of the benevolent neighbor to absolute perfection. His deception reached its most horrifying, intimate peak when he eventually courted and married a local Samoan woman. By forging a marital bond within the island community, he cemented his permanent status as a local fixture. He built a quiet, intensely ordinary family life, surrounded by the idyllic beauty of the Pacific and the genuine love of a woman who knew absolutely nothing of the darkness lurking behind his eyes. For years, he lived this extraordinary, terrifying duality. During the day, he was the devoted husband, the quiet farmer, the friendly neighbor who seamlessly blended into the vibrant tapestry of island life. But beneath that carefully constructed, profoundly false exterior, he remained the exact same calculating predator who had callously extinguished the life of Shannon Davis. He sat on the porch of his tropical home, looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean, perhaps believing that he had actually achieved the impossible. He had successfully outrun his own shadow, completely outsmarted the vast machinery of federal justice, and built a peaceful, untroubled paradise directly upon the buried, forgotten grave of his murdered wife. He lived in the deeply comforting illusion of permanent safety, completely unaware that across the ocean, the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the FBI was still quietly, methodically grinding forward, slowly piecing together the fragmented clues that would eventually lead them directly to his island door. The concept of the perfect crime is perhaps the most seductive and dangerous myth ever conceived in the criminal underworld, yet it is a mirage that inevitably dissolves when faced with the cold, unyielding persistence of time. For 7 years, David Davis lived under the carefully constructed alias of David Bell, basking in the tranquil beauty of American Samoa and believing that the thousands of miles of salt water between him and the Michigan authorities served as an impenetrable shield. He had cultivated a life of profound domesticity, becoming a fixture in the local island community, a man who worked the earth and spoke with a gentle, humble cadence. To his neighbors, his wife, and the local farmers who shared his daily labor, he was the embodiment of a simple, honest life. However, while he was planting crops and building a family in the South Pacific, the machinery of federal law enforcement was not a static force. It was a breathing, evolving, and relentlessly patient entity. The FBI had not forgotten the file on Shannon Davis. In the halls of federal offices, the case remained a point of professional commitment, a lingering testament to a victim whose life had been stolen and whose killer had dared to mock the system. The federal investigators understood that a man like Davis, despite his meticulous efforts to erase his identity, would eventually be betrayed by the very nature of human existence. People leave traces, whether in the form of old financial records, long-lost connections, or the simple necessity of identifying oneself in a world where records are increasingly interconnected. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived in 1987, was not the result of a single, heroic intervention but rather the culmination of years of quiet, painstaking data analysis, and the diligent cultivation of an intelligence network. The investigators had been casting their net across the globe, following the faint, ghostly whispers of information that drifted from the places where Davis had sought refuge. Every piece of documentation, every discarded scrap of history, and every possible lead regarding the whereabouts of the man who had staged that fateful horse-riding accident was analyzed through the lens of modern, more sophisticated investigative techniques. The digital and physical traces that Davis had left behind in his chaotic journey through Alaska and California served as the breadcrumbs for the federal agents. They systematically dismantled the protective layers of his anonymity, looking past the fake name and the fabricated history. Then, the long-awaited signal flashed within the system. A specific, highly credible tip emerged, pointing toward a man living in the remote reaches of the Pacific who possessed a physical profile, a behavioral history, and a timeline of movement that matched the fugitive they had been hunting for nearly a decade. The information was precise. A white man of a certain age, currently residing in American Samoa, was hiding in plain sight under the name David Bell. It was a moment of profound, quiet tension for the agents who had spent years chasing a shadow. They knew they had found him, but the unique geographical and political status of the American territory required a level of strategic planning that bordered on the theatrical. American Samoa, being a territory of the United States, granted the FBI the legal authority to act, but the remote nature of the island necessitated a surgical precision that would prevent the suspect from fleeing once more. The investigators were acutely aware that if Davis, who was currently living as Bell, suspected that his cover had been blown, the entire operation would be jeopardized. He was already a man who had shown himself capable of crossing oceans to evade justice. To let him slip away to neighboring islands, such as Western Samoa or other isolated patches of the Pacific, would be to potentially lose him forever into a labyrinth of international borders and jurisdictional nightmares. Therefore, the operation had to be executed in absolute secrecy. The federal agents began their deployment with the quiet, ghost-like efficiency that is the hallmark of high-stakes manhunts. They arrived in the territory not as a loud, intrusive force, but as quiet observers, blending into the background of the island life they were so carefully monitoring. They worked in tight coordination with local law enforcement, whose intimate knowledge of the island geography and population was vital to ensuring that the target had no possibility of retreat. The objective was clear. The element of surprise was the only weapon that would truly guarantee a successful capture. The atmosphere in the lead-up to the apprehension was thick with the weight of the years that had passed. The agents knew they were not just serving a warrant. They were finally answering for the injustice that had been allowed to fester since that humid day in July of 1980. They watched the man who called himself David Bell from a distance, observing his routines, his interactions with his unsuspecting wife, and the way he moved through the world with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be untouchable. The sheer audacity of his charade was a direct insult to the memory of Shannon Davis. Every day he spent working his fields was a day he had stolen from her, and every moment of peace he enjoyed in that tropical paradise was built upon the foundation of her cold, premature grave. The federal agents, driven by a professional sense of duty and a deeply human desire for restorative justice, prepared the final phase of the operation. They waited for the perfect moment, the instant where their target would be most vulnerable, and where the possibility of any violent reaction or escape would be minimized. They were aware of the profound impact their intervention would have on the local community, which had accepted this man into their fold, but their primary focus remained squarely on the objective. The truth, which had been buried for 7 long years, was about to be forcibly brought into the light. The day of the arrest dawned like any other in the South Pacific, with the sun beating down on the lush, vibrant landscape of American Samoa. To the outside observer, it was a day of routine, of labor, and of the familiar, rhythmic patterns of island life. But for the FBI team, it was the culmination of a decade of dedication. They moved into position with the silent, practiced movements of professionals, surrounding the home where David Davis had built his latest, most fragile illusion. When they finally confronted him, the transition from the life of a peaceful, unassuming farmer named David Bell back to the identity of a wanted murderer was instantaneous. The reaction of the community, and specifically the woman who had shared his life as a wife, was one of absolute, shattering confusion. The juxtaposition of the man they knew, a man of sweat, soil, and domestic commitment, with the reality of a cold-blooded killer, was a psychological blow that would leave lasting scars. The agents did not provide him with the opportunity to play his part further. They moved with the weight of legal authority, producing the cuffs that had been waiting for him for 7 years. The act of clicking those metal restraints into place was the final, definitive sound that broke the silence of the island sanctuary. It was the sound of the past catching up to the present. As he was led away in the face of his horrified neighbors, the transformation of David Davis was stark. The persona he had so carefully crafted, the kindly, weather-beaten farmer stripped away under the pressure of the federal presence, revealing the hollow, calculating man beneath. He had sought to hide in one of the most remote corners of the globe, yet he found that there is no geographical distance great enough to outrun the reach of a determined investigation. He was no longer the master of his own narrative. The story of his life was now being written by the authorities he had tried to outwit. The process of his removal from the island was handled with the same clinical efficiency as the arrest itself. There was to be no room for legal challenges on foreign soil, no opportunity for him to leverage the complexities of his remote location. He was to be transported back to the place where his sins had been committed, back to the landscape of his crime, and back to the jurisdiction where the justice system had been waiting, armed with the evidence that he had failed to permanently destroy. The flight back to the mainland was a journey through the consequences of his actions. As the distance between him and the island paradise grew, the reality of his situation must have begun to settle in with the cold certainty of a closing door. The man who had once thought he could outplay the law was now effectively a passenger to his own inevitable fate. The sheer distance he had traveled, the multiple identities he had shed, and the years he had spent living in a state of constant, underlying paranoia had all led to this singular, inescapable moment. He had believed he was a survivor, a man who could reinvent himself in any climate, but he was fundamentally a man who had been caught in a web of his own making. The federal agents kept him under a constant, watchful gaze, knowing that a man who has already sacrificed everything to stay free is a man who will stop at nothing, yet there was nowhere left for him to go. The ocean had been his shield, and now it was the perimeter of his cage. This moment of apprehension was not merely an administrative success. It was a profound vindication for the investigators who had refused to let the case of Shannon Davis go cold. It served as a reminder that the pursuit of truth is not bound by the limitations of a single police department or the forensic capabilities of a specific era. It is an enduring process. The federal team had navigated the challenges of international communication, the logistical hurdles of remote territorial enforcement, and the psychological burden of a long-term, high-stakes investigation to bring a fugitive to justice. They had stood against the clock and the vastness of the Pacific, and in the end, they had proven that while a criminal may be able to manipulate a scene, they cannot manipulate the trajectory of justice itself. The arrest in American Samoa effectively closed the book on the long, dark, and winding road that David Davis had traveled, bringing him back to the very place where he had started his life of lies, ready to face the judgment that had been eluding him since 1980. The stage was now set for the final act, a legal reckoning that would determine the rest of his life and finally provide a sense of closure, however imperfect, to the family and friends who had been haunted by the memory of the woman he had so callously betrayed. The journey from the humid, tropical shores of American Samoa back to the cold, stark reality of the Michigan courtroom was a transformation that mirrored the unraveling of the killer's life. David Davis, once the architect of a carefully curated, peaceful existence, was now stripped of the illusion of David Bell and forced to confront the concrete weight of his past. The logistics of this DLY, or extradition, were handled with the cold, precise clinical efficiency of the federal apparatus. There was no escape this time, no distant island to flee to, and no new identity to assume. He was transported across the vastness of the Pacific and the continent of North America, returning to the very environment where his descent into darkness had begun. During this transition, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted from a desperate, high-stakes manhunt to a methodical, cold-blooded legal process. The federal investigators, having successfully navigated the challenges of international jurisdictional boundaries and the complexities of remote territorial enforcement, were now prepared to turn their extensive accumulation of evidence into a permanent conviction. The months following his return were characterized by a grueling, meticulous preparation, as the prosecution pieced together the fragments of a case that had been allowed to linger for 7 long years. Every scrap of information gathered from the initial crime scene in 1980, every witness statement, and every detail uncovered during the years of his flight was synthesized into a narrative that could not be silenced. The legal proceedings that followed were far more than a simple trial. They were a comprehensive, systematic exposure of the calculated nature of the murder. The prosecutors understood that they were not merely presenting facts. They were engaged in the task of systematically dismantling the fabricated reality that Davis had spent years refining. The challenge lay in the fact that the crime scene had been expertly manipulated from the very beginning. The jury, which was composed of citizens who had lived through the era of the initial crime and were likely aware of the mystery that had plagued their rural community for so long, had to be taken through the anatomy of the deception. The prosecution focused heavily on the forensic inconsistencies that the local police had sensed but were initially unable to prove. They brought in expert witnesses who could speak to the mechanics of the staged accident, explaining to the court how the fatal wounds inflicted upon Shannon Davis could not have been the result of a fall from a horse, but rather were consistent with the deliberate, violent application of force by another person. The testimony was dry, technical, and undeniably damning, stripping away the romanticized notions of a tragic misfortune and revealing the raw, brutal truth beneath. As the trial progressed, the psychological weight of the proceedings intensified. The defense, caught in the impossible position of defending a man whose history of flight and identity theft painted a picture of absolute guilt, attempted to sow doubt, but the foundation they stood upon was crumbling. The prosecution utilized the narrative of his flight not just as evidence of a guilty conscience, but as a testament to the cold, calculating mind that had orchestrated the crime. They illustrated that his ability to discard his life, abandon his past, and establish a new identity in American Samoa was not the mark of an innocent man fearing a system that had failed him, but the signature of a predator who knew exactly what he had done and was willing to do anything to avoid the consequences. The presence of the testimony from those who had known Shannon Davis provided the necessary human component to the trial, serving as a reminder that this case was not a theoretical exercise in criminal jurisprudence, but a profound, irreversible loss of a human life. The court was forced to reconcile the man who had been a local, quiet farmer in the South Pacific with the man who had, with chilling detachment, staged a violent scene to cover up his own act of malice. The process of the trial was a reflection of the evolution of the American legal system itself. Whereas the original investigation had been hampered by a lack of forensic capability and a distorted crime scene, the trial was bolstered by the passage of time and the accumulation of a clear, undeniable trail of behavior. The evidence was not just physical, it was behavioral and chronological. The prosecution created a timeline of his actions, mapping his path from the Michigan farmstead to the isolation of Alaska, the anonymity of California, and finally the deceptive sanctuary of American Samoa. This mapping of his movements served as a damning indictment of his character. It was the movement of a man who had not just committed a crime, but who had dedicated his entire existence to the systematic deception of law enforcement. Each step of his flight was presented as a conscious, calculated decision, further distancing him from the sympathy of the court. The jury listened, captivated and horrified, as the story of the last decade was laid bare, exposing the man behind the mask and the victim who had been silenced beneath the lie. The defense struggled to present any credible alternative to the theory of the prosecution, and their efforts ultimately served only to highlight the strength of the evidence presented against Davis. When the witnesses were called, the testimonies provided a layered look at the life that Shannon Davis had been forced to leave behind, contrastively highlighting the hollow, artificial nature of the life her husband had tried to construct in her wake. There was no room for the narrative of a grieving, misunderstood husband. That story had been conclusively debunked by the years of evidence collection and the sheer impossibility of the original account. The jury, faced with the overwhelming accumulation of facts, was tasked with the weight of delivering a verdict that would finally bring the chapter of this long-delayed investigation to its inevitable conclusion. The intensity of the courtroom was palpable as the final arguments were made, with the prosecution focusing on the cold, unrelenting nature of the act and the defense attempting, in vain, to grasp at the shreds of a story that had long since been incinerated by the truth. The atmosphere during the final deliberations was one of heavy anticipation. The community, which had been haunted by the shadow of the 1980 tragedy for so many years, waited for the resolution that had seemed perpetually out of reach. The justice system, which had failed to act in the initial moments of the crime, was now poised to reclaim its credibility. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was not just an outcome of a trial. It was the final, definitive stamp of truth upon a story that had been defined by a decade of lies. David Davis, the man who had sought to vanish, the man who had tried to build a paradise upon the grave of his wife, was found guilty of murder. The realization that he would never again walk free, that the shadow of his actions had finally overtaken him, was clearly written in the gravity of the courtroom at that final moment. The sentence, a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, was the only outcome that could truly address the depth of the crime. It was a sentence that ensured the killer would spend the rest of his existence behind the very walls that he had so desperately spent years trying to escape. This conclusion was not merely an administrative necessity. It was an act of profound, restorative justice for those who had lived with the uncertainty and the pain of the unresolved loss. The trial had forced the truth to the surface, and in doing so, it had successfully restored the integrity of the investigation that had followed a long, winding, and sometimes agonizing path. The courtroom, once a place of uncertainty, had become a place of definitive resolution, where the facts had finally been laid out and a life of deceit had been conclusively ended. As David Davis was led away, the narrative of his flight, his change of identity, and his attempted escape into the obscurity of the South Pacific was officially relegated to the annals of history, a warning to any who believe they can outrun the reality of their own violent acts. The case had come full circle, moving from the quiet, rural fields of Michigan to the remote, isolated islands of American Samoa, and then finally back to the court where the law had the final word. The process had been long, complex, and filled with the challenges of a decade of investigative work, but in the end, it was the truth that remained, cold and unwavering. The victim, Shannon Davis, who had been hidden beneath a fabricated story for so long, had finally been given the justice that was denied to her at the moment of her death. The verdict stood as a stark reminder that even the most meticulously constructed illusion is ultimately vulnerable to the relentless, patient, and uncompromising nature of the pursuit of justice, ensuring that the legacy of a man like David Davis would be defined not by his successful escape, but by the ultimate, unavoidable consequences of his crimes. The sentencing of David Davis to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole served as the final, irrevocable period at the end of a long, tortured sentence that began in July of 1980. For the judicial system, this verdict was the culmination of an immense, collective effort that spanned nearly a decade, crossing multiple state lines and reaching deep into the isolated territories of the South Pacific. The courtroom, once a theater of intense scrutiny and mounting evidence, fell into a heavy, resonant silence as the judge delivered the sentence, a sound that carried the weight of years of agonizing waiting. For those in the gallery, including the family members of Shannon Davis who had carried the burden of her memory through 7 years of uncertainty, the sentence was not a moment of triumphant celebration, but rather a profound, necessary exhale. It was the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long, providing the finality required to begin the long, arduous process of genuine healing. The killer, who had spent the better part of a decade weaving a complex tapestry of lies to shield himself from this exact moment, was finally confronted with the immutable reality of his existence. He was no longer a farmer in American Samoa. He was no longer a traveler in Alaska. He was no longer a ghost in California. He was a convicted murderer who had been stripped of his autonomy, placed within the confines of a cage that he could never again leave. The finality of the sentence stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, erratic movement that had defined Davis's life since the murder. He had built his world on the assumption that he could outrun his own history, that he could simply transplant himself into new environments and recreate his reality from scratch. But the trial and subsequent sentencing exposed the fatal flaw in this logic. A crime is not a temporary event that can be outrun. It is an indelible stain that follows the perpetrator, marking them regardless of the geography they occupy. By attempting to flee, Davis had not escaped justice. He had only expanded the scope of his own capture. The evidence that he had attempted to hide, the flight, the aliases, the calculated abandonment of his former life, served, in the end, to solidify the case against him, turning his own evasive actions into a testament to his guilt. The court recognized that a man who dedicates his entire life to the pursuit of obscurity is not a man fleeing persecution, but a man running from the inescapable truth of his own malice. The life sentence was the only appropriate response to a decade of systematic deception and the cold, calculated termination of a human life. In the aftermath of the verdict, the narrative of the case underwent a necessary transition from a high-stakes manhunt to a solemn reflection on the nature of justice and the enduring impact of violent crime. The media coverage, which had been obsessed with the dramatic details of his capture in American Samoa, began to turn toward the more somber, human-centered elements of the story. The loss of Shannon Davis, which had been obscured by the spectacle of the fugitive's journey, was finally given the focus it deserved. The tragedy was no longer just a legal puzzle to be solved. It was the story of a woman whose life had been violently interrupted and whose death had been used as a convenient piece of a larger, darker game. The realization that her killer had lived a life of peaceful domesticity on a tropical island while her family mourned was a bitter pill that the public had to process. It served as a stark reminder that the justice system, while effective, often arrives far later than those left in the wake of a crime truly need. The delay in justice had prolonged the trauma for all those involved, turning a single act of violence into a protracted, 7-year struggle for recognition and resolution. The reflection on the case also necessitated a critical examination of the vulnerabilities that had allowed Davis to escape in the first place. The original failure to prosecute in 1980, caused by a combination of limited forensic tools and a disturbed, manipulated crime scene, highlighted the profound importance of the initial response to any report of suspicious death. The investigators who had finally cracked the case were the first to acknowledge that the path to justice had been far more difficult than it needed to be. They had spent years rectifying the mistakes of the past, proving that even when a crime scene is compromised, the truth can still be reconstructed through the patient, methodical application of modern investigative techniques. The case became a blueprint for federal law enforcement, demonstrating the power of interjurisdictional cooperation and the necessity of persistence in the face of what might otherwise appear to be a cold, unsolvable file. It reinforced the belief that no matter how long it takes, and no matter how far a suspect may travel, the truth has a gravitational pull that eventually brings the perpetrator back to the center of judgment. For the local community in Michigan, the resolution of the case brought a sense of closure that had been absent for nearly a decade. The rural landscape, which had once felt tainted by the presence of an unpunished murderer, could finally begin to shed that heavy, dark atmosphere. The memories of Shannon Davis were no longer tethered to the frustration of an unsolved mystery. They could finally be honored without the lingering, corrosive doubt of a pending or ignored injustice. The process of moving forward, however, was not instantaneous. The trauma caused by the manipulation of the local police, the distress sown by the escape of the suspect, and the years of silence had taken a significant toll. But with the sentencing of David Davis, the legal machinery had done its work, and the community could finally acknowledge the truth of what had happened in their midst. The case stood as a monumental example of how a singular act of violence can rupture a community, and how the eventual arrival of justice can, in time, help to mend those fractures. The finality of the sentence also underscored the profound, irreparable loss that lies at the heart of every true crime story. No matter the brilliance of the investigative work or the dramatic nature of the capture, the end result, a life behind bars, is an inadequate compensation for the life that was taken. The satisfaction that comes from a successful prosecution is always tempered by the awareness that the victim, Shannon Davis, will never be able to experience the resolution that the living have achieved. The story of her life, her potential, and her future was cut short by the cold, calculated choice of her husband, and that is a reality that no amount of justice can ever fully redress. The case remains a haunting reminder that in the face of such a loss, the only thing that the law can offer is the cold comfort of accountability. It is a necessary comfort and a profound one, but it is one that exists solely because of the absolute irrevocability of the initial crime. The focus of the story, in its final iteration, shifted away from the perpetrator and back to the victim, ensuring that the legacy of Shannon Davis would not be defined by the dramatic manhunt, but by the fact that her death, though long obscured by a veil of lies, had ultimately been brought into the light. As the years continue to pass, the story of David Davis and his failed attempt to outrun the law will undoubtedly remain a significant chapter in the annals of criminal history. It is a story that encapsulates the struggle between the audacity of a criminal mind and the persistence of a justice system designed to maintain the order of a society. It is a narrative of extremes, from the rural pastures of Michigan to the emerald green islands of the South Pacific, from the simplicity of a farmer's life to the complexity of a federal investigation, and from the initial confusion of an staged accident to the absolute certainty of a life sentence. The legacy of the case serves as a warning, a dark, cautionary tale for any who believe that they can construct a world that exists outside the reach of the truth. The law, though sometimes slow, though sometimes hampered by the limitations of human error and technological constraint, is ultimately as relentless as time itself. The case proved that no matter the sophistication of the disguise, no matter the distance of the flight, the truth is a constant that, once uncovered, cannot be hidden. The story of Davis is, in its essence, a testament to the fact that justice, even when it arrives late, is an inevitable force, one that serves as the foundation for the integrity of a society that refuses to allow the memory of its victims to be erased by the lies of their killers. It is a story of a long, winding path that finally reached its destination, leaving behind the wreckage of a broken life and the memory of a woman whose justice, though delayed, was finally, decisively, served. The legacy of a case as profound and enduring as the murder of Shannon Davis is not found merely in the cold precision of the trial transcripts or the logistical maps of an international manhunt. Instead, its true weight resides in the lingering, quiet questions that remain long after the gavel has struck and the prison gates have irrevocably closed. When we look back at the trajectory of David Davis, from that humid July morning in Michigan to the final, sun-drenched day of his apprehension in American Samoa, we are forced to confront the chilling fragility of human trust and the terrifying capacity of the human mind to construct a reality that bears absolutely no resemblance to the truth. The story is a stark, uncomfortable meditation on what it means for a crime to be forgotten and what it requires for the truth to be reclaimed from the darkness. It serves as a permanent, cautionary reminder that every act of violence, regardless of how meticulously it is buried beneath layers of deception, carries within it the seeds of its own eventual revelation. For those who study the annals of criminal behavior, this case offers a masterclass in the psychology of the perpetrator, the arrogance required to believe that a human life can be discarded, and the identity of the killer erased through a simple change of geography. The most haunting element of the Davis saga is the realization of the absolute dissonance between his two lives. On one hand, there was the man who, in a moment of cold-blooded, calculated rage, snuffed out the life of his wife and orchestrated a narrative so cruel it exploited the natural compassion of his neighbors. On the other hand, there was the David Bell of American Samoa, the gentle, agrarian soul who cultivated the earth, entered into a loving marriage, and became a cornerstone of his island community. The capacity for a single human being to inhabit these two contradictory worlds simultaneously is a profound, unsettling mystery that defies easy explanation. It challenges our fundamental understanding of human nature, forcing us to ask how someone can compartmentalize such a grotesque act of malice while functioning as a compassionate member of a society. The tragedy is amplified by the innocence of those who surrounded him in the South Pacific. His second wife, his neighbors, and his friends were all unknowingly living in the shadow of a grave, building their own lives upon the foundation of his fabricated peace. Their confusion and heartbreak in the wake of his arrest represent the collateral damage of his deception, a trauma that ripples outward far beyond the primary victim. Reflecting on the timeline of the investigation, one cannot help but be struck by the interplay between technological progress and the persistence of human intuition. The initial failure of the authorities in 1980 was not a failure of character, but a collision between a sophisticated, staged crime and the limitations of forensic science at that specific moment in history. The case stands as a definitive example of how scientific advancement does not just catch criminals, it corrects the historical record, ensuring that what was once a mystery can be transformed into an undeniable fact. The federal agents who inherited the file in the subsequent years were not just investigators. They were archivists of injustice, tasked with the duty of breathing life into a story that the killer assumed had been permanently silenced. Their success serves as a profound validation of the principle that justice is not a singular event that occurs at the moment of a crime, but a continuous, unrelenting process that can be sustained by the dedication of those who refuse to let the truth fade away. It teaches us that while a case might go cold, it is never truly dead as long as the record remains intact and the commitment to finding the truth persists. The broader societal implications of the Davis case touch upon the very nature of truth in a modern, increasingly interconnected world. Today, the ability of a fugitive to disappear into the anonymity of an isolated territory is vastly diminished by the interconnectedness of our global systems. We live in an age where digital footprints, instantaneous communication, and globalized databases have made the act of vanishing a near impossibility. Yet, the story of David Davis reminds us that even in an era of total surveillance, the human element, the ability of a person to lie to those around them, to project a false image of kindness, and to hide their past in plain sight, remains the greatest barrier to detection. The technology of law enforcement has advanced, but the fundamental struggle between the truth and the calculated lie remains the constant core of every criminal investigation. We are reminded that justice is ultimately dependent not just on the tools we possess, but on the stubborn, unyielding refusal of investigators to accept a narrative that feels wrong, even when it is presented as the absolute truth. For the community of Shannon Davis, the finality of the case was not a return to the world as it existed before the murder, for such a return is never possible. Instead, it was an entry into a world where the truth finally had the power to dictate the narrative. For years, they had been held captive by the uncertainty of the crime, their lives organized around the absence of their loved one and the silence of the law. The resolution allowed them to stop living in the past, to stop looking for answers in the shadows, and to finally begin the process of mourning in a way that was grounded in the reality of what had happened. This is perhaps the most crucial function of justice, to provide the space and the clarity required for the victims and their families to reclaim their own lives from the control of the person who disrupted them. By ensuring that Davis would spend his remaining days behind bars, the system did not just punish a criminal, it restored a sense of equilibrium to those who had been forced to live with the imbalance of his lies for so long. The story of David Davis will continue to be told because it possesses all the elements of a classic, sobering drama: the initial brutality, the seemingly perfect escape, the transformation of identity, and the long, slow, inevitable arc of justice. It is a story that refuses to be ignored because it touches upon the universal fear that the people we know and trust might be capable of darkness that we cannot fathom. It is a narrative that warns us of our own vulnerabilities, our willingness to accept a face value, our tendency to trust the comforting narrative of an accident over the uncomfortable possibility of malice, and our reliance on the assumption that the world is a safer place than it truly is. Yet, in the retelling of the story, we must also focus on the resilience of the truth. We must highlight the fact that no matter how long the shadow, the light eventually finds its way back to the scene of the crime. As we bring this narrative to a close, we are left with the image of a man whose life was built on a foundation of sand, believing that he was an architect of his own destiny, when in reality, he was merely a man waiting for the inevitable consequences of his choices. Shannon Davis, through the efforts of those who refuse to let her story be forgotten, has finally been given the only justice that this world can offer. Her life was not in vain, and her death, while horrific, became the catalyst for an investigation that redefined the limits of perseverance. The story is not just about the man who fled or the law that followed. It is about the quiet, persistent, and eventually triumphant power of the truth to find its way through the vast, dark ocean of deceit. In the end, the Pacific did not protect him. The new name did not hide him, and the passage of time did not absolve him. He was brought back, he was judged, and he was held accountable, ensuring that while the crime was a tragedy, the final result was a testament to the fact that, in the history of our justice system, there is no corner of the earth so remote and no secret so deeply buried that the truth cannot eventually reach it. The legacy of this case is the enduring, hopeful, and necessary belief that justice, however slow, is a force that will always, eventually, come home. The final chapter of this narrative is not defined by the man who sits behind steel bars, but rather by the enduring resonance of the case within the collective consciousness of those who followed it and the moral landscape it leaves behind for future investigators. As we step back from the immediacy of the verdict and the high-tension environment of the trial, we are left with a lingering reflection on the nature of long-term justice. The case of David Davis remains an essential study not just for its dramatic progression, but for the profound questions it raises regarding the obligation of the state to its citizens. When a crime remains unsolved, the community is left in a state of suspended animation, a condition where the wound is perpetually exposed because it has not been allowed to scar over with the closure of a legal conclusion. The 7 years that Davis spent on the run were 7 years of stolen peace for every individual who had known Shannon, and the fact that he was permitted to weave a new existence in the South Pacific highlights the terrifying reality of how easily a predator can be integrated into a new environment. This realization serves as a powerful argument for the necessity of systemic vigilance. Justice is not a static milestone, but a duty that must be actively pursued, often against the immense headwinds of time and logistical distance. Looking back, the evolution of the case from 1980 to 1987 serves as a bridge between two distinct eras of criminal justice. The original investigation, though limited by the forensic capabilities of the time, was not a failure of intent, but a failure of opportunity. It demonstrates the critical importance of preserving the integrity of a crime scene, for it is in those first, vital hours that the truth is most clearly articulated. The subsequent reopening of the file by federal authorities is a tribute to the power of institutional memory. In an age of rapid turnover and short attention spans, the decision to revisit an old, cold case, not because of new, revolutionary evidence, but because of a renewed commitment to the victim, is a powerful statement of values. It reminds us that every case file holds a life, and that the value of that life does not diminish with the passage of the calendar. The investigation was not driven by the flash of a breakthrough, but by the relentless, grinding, and often unglamorous work of cross-referencing, networking, and the patient cultivation of leads. This is the true, unsung reality of successful investigations. They are built upon a foundation of dogged, unyielding persistence, where the goal is not a quick headline, but the eventual, unavoidable certainty of the truth. The international dimension of this story, specifically the jurisdictional complexity of American Samoa, provides a fascinating look into the globalized nature of modern flight. Fugitives have always sought out the edges of the map, believing that the further they go, the more untraceable they become. Davis acted on the assumption that distance equals immunity, a belief that is increasingly obsolete in our interconnected world. Yet, his ability to successfully hide for years suggests that the geography of anonymity is as much about social structure as it is about physical location. By embedding himself within a culture that prioritized trust and communal support, he utilized the best parts of human nature to hide his own lack thereof. This creates a deeply unsettling irony. The very qualities that make for a vibrant, safe, and welcoming community are the same qualities that can be exploited by a sociopathic mind to create a sanctuary. The case leaves us with the uncomfortable task of balancing our inherent desire to trust our neighbors with the reality that some individuals are capable of performing the role of a friend while harboring the darkest of intentions. The psychological impact of the trial and the eventual conviction also forces us to consider the burden of those who were deceived. The woman who married David Bell and the neighbors who welcomed him into their lives were not just witnesses to his arrest. They were victims of his fraud. They had invested their trust, their love, and their community bonds into a man who was, in essence, a hollow vessel. The shattering of their reality is a secondary, yet equally significant, tragedy of the case. When a killer lives among us, the betrayal is personal for every person who had even a passing connection to them. The legal system focuses on the murder of Shannon Davis, but the ripple effects of the deception extend far wider, leaving a trail of broken hearts and tarnished memories in the remote corners of the Pacific. This serves as a reminder that the harm done by a violent criminal is not limited to the act of killing, but continues through the life of lies they build afterward, poisoning the interactions and relationships they have cultivated in their flight. In the final assessment, the story of David Davis is a testament to the fact that while the law may arrive late, its arrival is inevitable for those who refuse to stop running. It is a story that refuses to let the past remain buried, asserting that the truth has a persistence that outlasts the cleverness of any criminal. As the years continue to accumulate since his conviction, the case stands as a landmark in the history of federal investigation, a reference point for how to handle complex, cross-border manhunts. It provides a sense of profound relief for those who value the principle of accountability, reassuring us that there is no destination on earth beyond the reach of justice. The memory of Shannon Davis, once obscured by the artificial narrative of a horse-riding accident, has been restored to its proper place as a life that was unjustly taken and for whom the ultimate, necessary service of legal truth was eventually performed. Her legacy is no longer tied to the silence of her grave, but to the resounding, definitive resolution of her murder. As we conclude this exploration, we must acknowledge the broader, humbling reality that this story is but one of many. There are countless other files sitting in drawers, other victims whose voices are waiting to be heard, and other killers who are currently living under the illusion of their own successful evasion. The Davis case is a call to action for the preservation of justice, a reminder that the work of the investigator is a sacred trust. It is the work of transforming chaos into order, of taking a distorted, manipulated history and carefully, precisely, and slowly restoring it to its original, unvarnished form. It is a labor of love for the truth, and it is a labor that demands our continued support and our unwavering attention. The story of the Michigan farmer who tried to hide on a Pacific island is ultimately a story about the triumph of the law over the arrogance of the individual. It is a story that reminds us that no matter how much we may change our name, our location, or our entire persona, we can never truly leave behind the choices we have made. The truth, like time, is an unstoppable force, and in the end, it is the only thing that truly survives the passage of years. The final image we are left with is one of stillness. The tropical breezes of American Samoa continue to blow over the landscape where Davis once walked. The rural fields of Michigan continue to change with the seasons, and the files that document the journey from start to finish remain in the archives of the FBI, a permanent record of a struggle that lasted a decade. This record serves as a testament to the belief that even the most desperate, most elaborate, and most distant attempts to escape reality will eventually fail. The story provides a sense of closure not just for the family of the victim, but for all of us who seek to live in a world where actions have consequences and where the truth is considered the absolute highest authority. We find comfort in the fact that, at the end of every road, no matter how many twists and turns it may take, there is a destination where the story finally stops, where the lies are stripped away, and where the justice that was sought is finally, irrevocably achieved. The life of Shannon Davis was the beginning of this journey, and the cold, unyielding reality of the prison cell is its end. In between, there is a decade of human drama, of professional dedication, and of a relentless search that proves, once and for all, that the reach of justice is limited only by the willingness of those who seek it. The case is closed, the story is written, and the truth, as it always does, remains standing in the clear, sharp light of day, unburdened by the darkness that once attempted to consume it. As the dust finally settles upon the extensive legal history and the haunting narrative of David Davis, we are invited to consider the architecture of memory itself. How do we, as a society, collectively store the stories of those who were lost and the villains who sought to erase them? The story of Shannon Davis is not just a cold case that turned into a successful prosecution. It is a profound lesson in the permanence of action. Every choice, especially one as final and devastating as the taking of a human life, leaves a resonance that vibrates through the years, indifferent to the geographical distance a fugitive may put between themselves and the scene of their crime. We have traced the trajectory of a man who viewed the world as a game of chess, believing that if he could just keep moving, keep changing his title, and keep shifting his coordinates, he could effectively cheat the system of morality. Yet, the outcome of his long flight proves that the game of chess is played against a reality that is far more patient, far more observant, and ultimately far more powerful than any individual's ability to manipulate it. The conclusion of this case offers us a rare, crystalline view of justice as a slow-moving, gravitational force that eventually pulls all things toward their inevitable center. The endurance of the case is also a tribute to the silent, persistent work of the individuals who carried the weight of the investigation long before the public spotlight ever focused on the remote islands of the South Pacific. In the world of true crime, there is a tendency to Leoneize the dramatic climax, the moment of the arrest, the tension of the trial, the finality of the verdict. However, the true heartbeat of this story lies in the months and years of quiet, often frustrating labor that occurred between 1980 and 1987. It was in the thousands of hours of reviewing documents, the endless conversations with witnesses whose memories were beginning to fade, and the stubborn refusal to accept the initial failure as the final word. This is the unsung heroism of the investigative process. It is the work of people who understand that their commitment is not to a deadline or a quarterly report, but to a person who is no longer here to advocate for themselves. By acting as the voice for Shannon Davis, the investigators proved that the justice system, despite its flaws, is capable of profound redemption, provided it is steered by those who possess the moral fortitude to stay the course through the long, dark periods of uncertainty. When we consider the transition of David Davis into the persona of David Bell, we are confronted with the terrifying versatility of the human identity. He demonstrated that with enough discipline, a person can effectively rewrite their own autobiography, shedding the habits of their past and adopting the customs of a completely different culture. This ability to adapt is, in most contexts, a virtue. It allows for growth, for reconciliation, and for the capacity to start anew. Yet, in the hands of a sociopath, it becomes a weapon. It turns the very mechanisms of social integration into a shroud, allowing the perpetrator to blend into the scenery of a new life, while the wreckage of their past remains hidden from those around them. The horror of his years in American Samoa is not just that he was hiding, but that he was thriving. He was enjoying the fruits of a community that accepted him without reservation, a community whose genuine warmth was essentially hijacked to provide him with a cloak of normalcy. This forces us to realize that the danger of a predator is not always found in their overt aggression, but often in their ability to perform the role of a neighbor, a husband, or a worker with such chilling, clinical precision that they become indistinguishable from the truly benevolent souls around them. The resolution of the case also serves as a definitive argument for the necessity of unified, cross-jurisdictional law enforcement. The challenges faced by the FBI in operating within the unique political status of American Samoa required a level of diplomatic and legal finesse that highlights the increasing complexity of international police work. As our world becomes more fluid and travel becomes more accessible, the barriers that once protected fugitives, be they state lines, national borders, or remote oceanic territories, are becoming less and less effective. The success of the Davis capture is a benchmark for how federal agencies can navigate these complexities, proving that if the intent to reach the suspect is strong enough, there is no boundary that cannot be breached. It is an encouraging sign for the future of criminal justice, suggesting that the era of the disappearing fugitive is drawing to a close, replaced by an era of globalized accountability, where the reach of the law is increasingly absolute. Yet, even with the finality of the prison sentence, the case leaves behind a sense of somber weight. We are reminded that every story of justice served is preceded by a story of tragedy that can never be undone. The life of Shannon Davis was not a prelude to an investigation. It was a life of inherent value, one that was stolen in a moment of violence that remains, even decades later, impossible to justify or truly comprehend. The sentence of life without parole is a just and necessary action, but it is one that exists solely because of the absolute, final loss of the victim. We find ourselves, once again, returning to the core of the true crime genre, the recognition that our systems of justice are not designed to create balance, for balance is impossible after a murder, but to establish a boundary. By placing the killer behind bars, the state declares that the act was not merely a private tragedy, but a public transgression, one that requires a permanent separation between the offender and the world they violated. It is the only way that a society can maintain its integrity while honoring the memory of those who have been wronged. As we look toward the future, the legacy of this case will continue to serve as a guide for those who are tasked with the heavy responsibility of investigation. It will be taught as an example of why the persistence of the investigator is the most valuable asset in the pursuit of truth. It will stand as a reminder that the passage of time is not an enemy to justice, but a different kind of reality that must be navigated with patience and skill. Most importantly, it will remain a beacon for those who find themselves in the darkest hours of an unsolved crime, offering the hope that no matter how distant the light may seem, the truth is always moving toward them, carried forward by the hands of those who refuse to give up. The Pacific Ocean, once thought to be a wall, is now seen as the path that finally led the authorities to the truth. The island, once a sanctuary, is now remembered as the stage of his final, inevitable capture. And the story of the Michigan farmer, the Alaskan wanderer, and the Samoan villager is now unified into the single, honest story of a man named David Davis who committed a murder, ran, and was eventually brought home to face the consequences he had spent 7 years trying to outrun. The silence that now envelopes the memory of Shannon Davis is no longer the silence of an unresolved secret, but the silence of a life that has been honored through the full, exhaustive application of the law. We leave this story not with a sense of triumph, but with a sense of profound, quiet clarity. The truth has been served, the record has been corrected, and the long, winding road that began on that July day in 1980 has finally reached its end. In the grand tapestry of human events, this case is but one thread, yet it is a thread that holds a powerful, universal lesson, that the truth is the most durable substance we possess, and that no matter the efforts to obscure it, suppress it, or outrun it, it remains the only thing that ultimately defines us. We carry this lesson forward, tempered by the somber realization of the cost, but fortified by the unshakable, necessary belief that justice, however long it takes, is the anchor upon which a civilized world must always rely. The story of David Davis is closed, and in its closing, we find the quiet, steady peace that only the truth can provide. The final reflection on the case of David Davis requires us to look beyond the mechanics of the law and into the very fabric of our shared humanity, where the boundaries between the known and the unknown, between the public narrative and the private truth, are constantly being negotiated. In the many years since the final verdict was rendered, the story has settled into the bedrock of true crime history as a definitive example of the struggle for accountability. When we consider the breadth of the saga, the initial act of violence in the quiet Michigan countryside, the desperate years of flight across the vast American continent, and the eventual, jarring discovery on a remote Pacific island, we are essentially observing the lifespan of a single, agonizing truth that refused to be extinguished. It is a story that reveals the resilience of the truth when it is guarded by those who refuse to let the passage of time erode their sense of duty. The fact that the story had to travel across an ocean and into a completely different culture to find its resolution only reinforces the idea that the truth is universal, transcending the physical limitations of our world and the psychological defenses that the guilty construct to insulate themselves from reality. As we dwell upon the internal landscape of the perpetrator, we are faced with the chilling realization that for David Davis, the concept of a new identity was not a form of redemption, but a tool of evasion. He did not go to American Samoa to become a new man. He went there to bury the old one in a place where he believed no one would ever think to look. This is the crucial distinction between the possibility of human change and the tactical use of reinvention. Redemption requires the acknowledgement of the past and the acceptance of its consequences, whereas Davis's journey was the absolute negation of his past. By attempting to live as David Bell, He was not moving forward. He was merely existing in a state of suspended animation, perpetually fleeing from the inevitable. The tragedy is that he was so effective at this performance that he managed to deceive an entire community, proving that the human capacity for goodness and trust is, in many ways, the very thing that makes the presence of a predator so dangerously invisible. It is a profound irony that the very community that provided him with a sanctuary was also the place where his deception was finally and fully exposed. The role of the federal investigators throughout this ordeal cannot be overstated, as they represented the bridge between the initial, broken hope of the 1980s and the final, successful conclusion of the late 1980s. Their work was the antidote to the cynicism that often plagues our view of the justice system. In a world where we are accustomed to seeing the news cycles move at breakneck speed, where stories are picked up and dropped with little regard for the lasting trauma they cause, the FBI's commitment to this file stands as a beacon of professional integrity. They were not looking for a sensational end. They were looking for a factual one. Their persistence serves as a template for what institutional memory can achieve when it is leveraged correctly. By treating the file of Shannon Davis not as a stagnant record of a past failure, but as a living mandate for action, they demonstrated that the justice system is only as effective as the dedication of the individuals who refuse to stop working. This is the most valuable lesson the case offers to the next generation of law enforcement professionals, that there is no substitute for the stubborn, unwavering belief that every victim deserves the full weight of the law to be applied to their case, regardless of how much time has passed or how many miles stand in the way. We must also contemplate the survivors, not just the family of Shannon, but the victims of the deception in American Samoa. Their experience teaches us about the fragility of our connections and the vulnerability inherent in being human. When we open our lives to someone, when we trust them with our friendship and our love, we are taking a leap of faith that is entirely dependent on the honesty of the other person. To have that trust betrayed by someone who has lived a lie for years is a profound violation that cuts much deeper than the surface. Their recovery is a process that we rarely see, as the focus of the public narrative is almost always on the crime and the capture. Yet, their ability to navigate the aftermath, to process the truth, and to eventually move forward is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. They are the silent witnesses to the cost of Davis's choices, and their perspective is an essential part of the story, serving to humanize the collateral damage that is so often forgotten in the aftermath of a dramatic arrest. In contemplating the legacy of the murder of Shannon Davis, we are inevitably led to the theme of inevitable consequences. The story is a cautionary tale that resonates with the core of our moral understanding, that our actions define us, and that no matter how hard we try to separate ourselves from what we have done, the past is an inseparable part of our existence. The arc of Davis's life, from his position as a trusted spouse to his eventual status as a life-sentence prisoner, is a dramatic manifestation of this truth. He lived with the illusion of control, believing that his actions in 1980 could be neatly compartmentalized away from the rest of his life. But reality does not operate in compartments. It is a seamless, interconnected whole where the choices we make at one moment inevitably shape the possibilities of the next. The sentence he received was not just a punishment. It was an acknowledgement that the reality he had tried to escape had finally caught up to him. He was a man who tried to live outside of history, and the result was that history eventually closed around him with the force of an unyielding door. As we bring this series of reflections to a close, we find that the story of David Davis is, in its final form, a story about the triumph of the law over the darkness of human nature. It is a narrative that reassures us that even when we are confronted with the most horrific possibilities, we have systems, and more importantly, we have people who are dedicated to the pursuit of the truth. The story does not offer us a world without violence, for such a world does not exist, but it does offer us a world where violence is met with a response that is measured, persistent, and ultimately successful. The silence of the archive, where the files on the Davis case now rest, is no longer an empty silence. It is a filled, satisfied silence, representing the completion of a long and difficult labor. We can look at this case and find a degree of solace in the fact that, for all the complexity of the world and all the cleverness of the criminal mind, the truth remains the most powerful thing we have. It is the anchor that holds us to reality, and it is the standard by which we measure our commitment to one another. We leave this case with the understanding that the process of justice is, at its heart, an act of remembrance. By investigating, by prosecuting, and by documenting every detail of the crime and the subsequent flight, we are honoring the reality of Shannon Davis's life. We are refusing to let her story be reduced to a footnote or a forgotten casualty. We are ensuring that the man who took her life did not also get to define the narrative of her end. This is the ultimate victory of the investigative process. It is the ability to take a life that was prematurely stolen and to ensure that, through the lens of history, it is given the recognition and the dignity it deserves. The story of David Davis, in all its darkness and all its eventual clarity, is a story that we carry forward with us as a testament to the belief that the truth is never finished, and that the search for justice is a journey that we are all, in some small way, responsible for sustaining. The case is closed, the record is settled, and the truth remains, standing as a silent, unmoving guardian of the fact that, in the end, justice is the only language that the truth truly understands. The journey from the Michigan farm to the Pacific prison is complete, leaving behind the quiet, steady certainty that even the deepest secrets are eventually brought into the light, and that those who seek them will never be led astray so long as they remain faithful to the facts. The legacy of Shannon Davis is finally, and firmly, hers once again. As we stand at the threshold of concluding this expansive, 10-part examination of the life, crime, and eventual capture of David Davis, it is necessary to pause and consider the collective impact of such a narrative. We have traversed the rural geography of Michigan in the sweltering heat of 1980, tracked a ghost through the frozen wilderness of Alaska, navigated the bustling anonymity of California, and finally settled into the serene, deceptive tranquility of American Samoa. Throughout this long journey, we have dissected the anatomy of a murder, the intricate mechanics of a staged accident, the psychological toll of a decade of evasion, and the relentless, mechanical precision of the federal pursuit. We have observed the intersection of human fallibility and the unwavering resolve of those tasked with the enforcement of law. What emerges from this comprehensive look is not merely the story of a man who killed his wife, but a profound testament to the nature of truth itself. The truth, as demonstrated here, is not an ephemeral concept that can be altered by the passage of time or the crossing of oceans. It is a rigid, enduring foundation that eventually asserts itself, regardless of the structures built upon it. David Davis built a life of 7 years, a significant, substantial portion of his existence, upon the foundation of a lie. He invested his labor, his emotions, and his identity into a persona that was, in the final analysis, entirely hollow. When the truth finally arrived in the form of the FBI, that foundation did not merely crack, it dissolved instantly, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard reality of the crime he had committed in 1980. We must also reflect on the nature of the investigator's burden. Throughout the years of searching, the agents who worked the Davis file were engaged in a form of professional stoicism that is rarely recognized. They were working on a case that had no immediate payoff, no daily headlines, and no clear guarantee of a successful conclusion. They were carrying the weight of a victim who could no longer speak, and they were pursuing a target who had every tactical advantage that a decade of Head Start could provide. The successful apprehension of Davis is a victory for the concept of systemic accountability. It tells us that the state does not simply forget, and that the files on our past transgressions are not subject to a statute of limitations that applies to the morality of our actions. There is a permanence to the records that we create in this world, and for those who believe they can live outside the boundaries of societal conduct, the case of David Davis serves as a grim, undeniable warning. The federal apparatus is designed for this very purpose, to maintain a long-term perspective on the pursuit of justice, ensuring that the passage of years is not synonymous with the loss of consequence. In the final, quiet moments of this analysis, we are brought back to the memory of Shannon Davis. It is easy, in the process of recounting the movements of a fugitive, to lose sight of the primary tragedy that necessitated the entire saga. Shannon was not a participant in the drama of the manhunt. She was the silent center around which everything else revolved. Her life, extinguished in the prime of her years in the Michigan countryside, was the original, unalterable fact from which all subsequent actions followed. The justice that was served in the late 1980s was an act of restitution for her, a way of ensuring that her story was not concluded by the deceitful narrative her husband had attempted to impose upon her memory. By bringing David Davis to justice, the state effectively reclaimed her story, stripping away the lie of the horse riding accident and replacing it with the reality of her murder. This is the most profound and necessary duty of the legal system, not to provide a sense of happiness, which is impossible in the face of such a loss, but to provide a sense of order, to align the public record with the private reality of the victim's experience. The legacy of this case will continue to be a part of the discourse on criminal justice for as long as we remain interested in the struggle between the individual and the law. It will be referenced in training materials for federal agents, in studies regarding the psychological profiles of long-term fugitives, and in the private conversations of those who seek to understand the darker edges of human behavior. It is a complete story, one that has been told from the moment of the crime to the moment of the ultimate sanction. As we place this narrative back into the archives of history, we do so with a renewed sense of clarity. We see the path of the fugitive, we see the persistence of the investigator, and we see the inevitable gravity of the truth. We see that the world is a complex, often dangerous place, but it is also a place where the pursuit of truth remains the most vital and necessary project we can undertake. We conclude our study with the awareness that the story of David Davis is a closed book, a record that has been fully transcribed, documented, and placed in its proper context. The man who tried to be a ghost is now a prisoner. The man who tried to rewrite his life is now a subject of history, and the woman who is lost has finally been accorded the justice that the passage of time could not deny her. As we look toward the future, we carry with us the wisdom of this case, that we must never underestimate the capacity of the truth to find its own way into the light, and we must never lose our belief that justice, however long it may take, is an absolute necessity for the integrity of our society. The story ends not in the excitement of a chase, but in the profound silence of a resolved life. The files have been shelved, the investigators have moved on to new challenges, and the memory of these events has become a permanent part of the lore of federal law enforcement. We walk away from this study with a deeper appreciation for the work that is done in the dark and a greater confidence in the light that ultimately reveals the reality of our shared experience. The tragedy of Shannon Davis was a singular, catastrophic event, but the response to it was a collaborative, multi-generational effort that demonstrated the very best of our institutions. It is a story that proves, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there is no amount of planning, no degree of deception, and no distance of flight that can ultimately separate a guilty man from the reality of his own actions. The truth stands, as it has always stood, as the final and only authority in the court of history. The journey is over. The truth is clear, and the story of the fugitive from Michigan, who found his end in the middle of the Pacific, is now and forever a matter of record, marking the final, inevitable arrival of justice at its long-awaited destination. The conclusion of this 11-part examination brings us to a final, contemplative synthesis of the saga of David Davis, a man whose life became a testament to the futility of escaping the moral gravity of one's own actions. Having followed this narrative from the initial, brutal termination of a life in rural Michigan through the intricate, globalized game of hide-and-seek that defined the next 7 years, we find ourselves at the intersection of history and resolution. This case serves as more than just a procedural account of an investigation. It is a profound exploration of the enduring power of truth to reclaim a narrative that had been violently and deceptively seized. When we consider the breadth of what has been uncovered, the initial, calculated fabrication of an accident, the cold-blooded abandonment of identity, the audacious migration to the remote reaches of American Samoa, and the final, systematic dismantling of that false life by the FBI, we are essentially witnessing the slow, relentless grinding of the wheels of justice. It is a process that operates on a timeline indifferent to the desires of the criminal, moving with an inexorable patience that eventually consumes even the most carefully constructed delusions. The legacy of the David Davis case is, at its heart, a reminder that the human soul possesses a profound capacity for both darkness and light. On one side, we have the perpetrator, a man whose intellect was focused entirely on the machinery of deception, using his social interactions and his geographic choices as tools to construct a fortress of lies. His ability to build a new life in the Pacific, to form genuine bonds with a new wife, and to become a contributing member of an island community speaks to the terrifying versatility of a sociopathic mind. It shows us that a criminal does not always wear the mask of a monster. Often, they wear the mask of the most ordinary, reliable, and hardworking person in the room. This reality is what makes the investigation so harrowing. It forces us to confront the fact that our everyday definitions of trustworthiness are not infallible, and that the distance between a neighbor and a predator can be bridged by a carefully maintained silence. On the other side of this narrative, we have the investigators, whose work represents the triumph of institutional memory and the persistence of the moral imperative. They did not simply chase a suspect, they chased the truth, refusing to let the expiration of time or the depletion of resources dictate the outcome of their efforts. This 11-part journey has also allowed us to examine the secondary effects of such a crime, the ripples of trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victim. The community in American Samoa, once a haven of peace, was fundamentally altered by the discovery that the man they had welcomed into their fold was, in reality, a fugitive wanted for murder. Their heartbreak and their subsequent struggle to reconcile their memory of David Bell with the reality of David Davis is a tragedy that is too often overlooked in the pursuit of a verdict. It reminds us that every crime is a stone dropped into the center of a still lake, with the waves of the resulting destruction reaching out in ways that the perpetrator rarely considers, and that the justice system rarely has the capacity to fully heal. The law can incarcerate the killer, but it cannot repair the shattered trust of the community or erase the memory of the betrayal. This is the hidden cost of a life of lies, a cost that is paid by the innocent long after the guilty have been removed from society. As we evaluate the role of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, we are looking at an entity that functions as the collective conscience of the nation in the face of violent crime. The Davis case demonstrates the immense value of professional persistence. In an era where information moves at the speed of light, there is a temptation to believe that if a case isn't solved in the first few days, it will never be solved. The Davis investigation proves the contrary. It shows that by maintaining an unwavering focus on the facts, by methodically cataloging the movements of a suspect, and by remaining patient in the face of logistical obstacles, the truth can be successfully unearthed even after years of intentional obfuscation. The FBI's success in Samoa was not a stroke of luck. It was the inevitable result of an exhaustive, decade-long commitment to a single outcome. It serves as a gold standard for how institutional persistence can defeat the cleverness of the individual, provided that the institution is willing to invest the necessary time and resources. The resolution of the case also highlights the absolute necessity of our legal frameworks in creating a boundary between the perpetrator and the society they have violated. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is a harsh sentence, but it is one that is fundamentally required by the nature of the crime and the character of the criminal. Davis's life of flight and deception proved that he possessed no remorse and no intent to ever reconcile with the reality of his actions. He was a man who would have continued to live behind the mask of David Bell until the end of his days, had the law not intervened. Thus, the cage of his final imprisonment is not just a punishment for the murder of Shannon Davis, it is the necessary conclusion to a decade-long performance that had to be forcibly brought to a close. It is the final establishment of order in a story that had been defined by the chaotic, uncontrolled movement of a man who thought he could define his own reality. As we conclude this series, we must acknowledge the victim, Shannon Davis, whose life was not defined by the tragedy of her end, but by the years she was denied. The restoration of her story, the transition from the victim of a horse riding accident to the victim of a calculated murder, is the ultimate service that the investigative process performed. It is a way of ensuring that the truth of her existence is not forever eclipsed by the lie that her husband tried to cast upon it. This is the true, solemn duty of the true crime chronicler, to keep the light focused on the reality of the victim while systematically dismantling the fiction of the perpetrator. It is a process that requires both empathy for the lost and the cold, hard objective analysis of the actions that led to their demise. By performing this duty, we acknowledge that while the past cannot be changed, it can be clarified, and in that clarification, we find a small, necessary measure of peace. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast, blue barrier that seemed to offer an eternal sanctuary, is now understood as the setting of a capture that was as inevitable as it was dramatic. The island of American Samoa, with its vibrant, trusting, and hospitable community, has reclaimed its identity, separating itself from the shadow of the man who hid in plain sight among them. The fields of Michigan, where the original, dark events took place, have continued to turn through the seasons, the land itself bearing no record of the violence that was visited upon it so long ago. The memory of the case, however, remains fixed in the archives of the justice system, a permanent record of the struggle and the ultimate triumph of the truth over the darkness. We leave this story with the knowledge that justice is not merely a legal outcome, but a moral demand that the truth be acknowledged, documented, and respected. We understand that no matter how long the flight, and no matter how profound the deception, the truth is the only element in our existence that cannot be permanently suppressed. Finally, we reflect on the nature of our own role as observers of this human drama. By engaging with this story, by parsing through the details, and by considering the implications of the actions taken by both the criminal and the investigators, we are participating in the process of historical remembrance. We are asserting that the lives we live, the crimes we commit, and the justice we pursue are not fleeting events, but are part of a larger, ongoing narrative about the integrity of our society. The story of David Davis is closed, not because we have forgotten it, but because it has reached its necessary conclusion. The truth has been fully accounted for, the victim has been honored through the application of the law, and the perpetrator has been removed from the history he sought to rewrite. We walk away from this final chapter with a steady, reassuring knowledge that even in a world capable of such profound darkness, there is an equally profound, persistent, and unyielding commitment to the light. The journey from the quiet fields of Michigan to the cells of the prison system was long, it was difficult, and it was fraught with the complexities of human malice, yet it arrived, as all things must, at the only destination where the truth could finally rest. The case is finished, the truth is established, and the life of Shannon Davis is, at long last, shielded by the permanent, enduring clarity of the justice that was promised to her so many years ago.